Hello and good day, Prime Minister Trudeau. This video isn't like the others. It isn't part of the chronology. This video is about essentially single events, one-off things that happened that convey the cruelty and violence and sadism of the three women that held me captive for 2 years. The first issue was the destruction of my deceased son's funeral items. Roseanne Williams screamed at me every night that she came to her house. That occurred on more than 280 occasions over the 540 days that made up the 18 months that I was held against my will in her home, while she lived at a cottage in Labelle. During these screaming sessions, she bragged about everything, and that included screaming about my deceased son and his living mother. She raised that topic every night. Roseanne had learned that it was my plan to go to Western Canada to visit my son's grave and his living mother when I was released from captivity. Roseanne learned that I was collecting items to include in my son's funeral because his mother and I had not had a funeral together because of my life overseas. In the fall and winter of 2018, Roseanne Williams forbid me from trapping on her property as a means of limiting my income and access to food, while she starved Larry and I that year. I made arrangements with other property owners to trap on their property for them and myself. Roseanne knew that I was selling everything that I trapped for money because Larry can't eat many items because of the choking hazards associated with a Huntington's patient. She knew the money was for gas and for food for Larry. Roseanne was furious, and in December of 2018, during one of her searches of the house for food, she found the items that I had been saving and putting away to use at my son's funeral. Roseanne Williams made a commotion to lure me into the garage. She made me watch as she dumped all the items for my son's funeral on the ground. She made me watch as she kicked them into the gravel just outside the garage. She made me watch as she stomped on them and ground them into the gravel, breaking and smashing all the items that I had been saving during my captivity to show my son's mother during his funeral. She then grabbed motor oil off the shelf, and she poured motor oil all over everything that I had tried to save for my son's funeral. She did this to make sure that I couldn't fix or recover any of the items that she destroyed. Watching her do this on the anniversary of my grandfather's death was the event that drove me to Community and Victim Services in late December of 2018. Roseanne Williams, my rapist, was at the time being held and tortured by her own mother in her mother's house, and she had been held there since October. That was also done over the topic of food. Roseanne was having weekly mental breakdowns in front of the entire family at the supper table, and she was having nightly mental breakdowns in front of me as part of the screaming matches. Both of these mental breakdowns were only getting worse. She was getting more and more violent, publicly and privately. I made arrangements through Community and Victim Services to move to a men's shelter in Halifax in mid-January. Community Services in Liverpool was coordinating this, and they said that when I was ready, it would only take a phone call, and a car would come and pick me up. They suggested that I do this while Roseanne was at work. Roseanne started a second attempt to kill her husband that same week. That was a coincidence. She had no idea that I was planning to leave. I didn't leave, though, because I correctly guessed that the January issue would spiral into another attempt on Larry's life, because everything in my family was that violent at that point. Roseanne was going to kill somebody, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't Larry. When Roseanne ultimately releases me in April of 2019, it was solely because her son was returning from Australia. No other reason. She would never be able to hide what was happening from him, so she got rid of me as soon as she found out that he was coming back. Roseanne Williams had been starving Larry and I since April of 2018. I'd been going to the food bank part-time since April, and full-time since July of 2018. I couldn't get everything to feed Larry, though. In the summer and the fall, I sold garden vegetables for money to put gas in the truck and to buy meat for Larry. I can catch fish all summer long, but he can't have them due to the bones and the Huntington's patient's extreme choking hazards. In the fall, I switched to trapping again. Larry can't have anything with bones, So I sold everything I trapped for gas money and money to buy him meat that he could have. The superstore in Liverpool put picnic hams on sale that fall, and I got them at 90 cents a pound, so I bought $100 worth, as that would be meat for Larry for the entire winter. I boned out the hams and salted the meat in 1-pound lots and stored it in buckets hidden in the stone walls around Roseanne's property. My grandfather had taught me to do this as a child. I had to do this as an adult because Roseanne was routinely searching the house and stealing any food that she found so that Larry would be hungry. She had been doing this since the end of August, when she stole 3 weeks of food bank donations and unknowingly gave them to her son to eat when he returned from Australia. I had salt meat cached all over Roseanne's property. The trick was waiting until all the bears had gone to hibernate, because they could easily tear a stone wall apart. And the day before I wanted or needed meat for Larry, I would simply go for a walk in the woods. I would locate a cache and remove a 1-pound piece of meat, because that was the size I had cut it to. And I would bring it home and soak it out for most of the day to cut the salt in it. I salted and cached all the bones as well to make Larry soups, another trick my grandfather taught me as a child when I was being starved by these women back then. A spin-off of the salt meat incident is the lobster bait incident. Roseanne Williams starved me until I lost 1/3 of my body weight in only a matter of months. I lost 75% of my muscle mass and 15% of my bone mass. I lost an inch in height. I had gone from easily lifting and walking with 150 pounds of lobster bait in May of 2018, after taking my medications for a winter, to dislocating my shoulder if I tried to lift anything more than 20 pounds in November of 2018. Starvation, no medication, and detransitioning was that aggressive. Roseanne Williams screamed at me nightly that Larry would be killed if I was seen with any food other than what I was given at supper. I was already having seizures. They had started in August, and I was concerned that I was going to die that winter. My health was that poor. So I sort of broke one of Roseanne's rules. I didn't eat food per se. My Uncle Dennis was a lobster fisherman in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. He buys fresh bait all winter long from a business in Shelburne, a small community down the highway. I offered to go get it for him in exchange for a little bit of bait so I could trap bobcats. That was what I told him anyway. And he knew that I would give him the bobcats anyway, because he had always wanted runners for his couch made from bobcat hides. But we had to ask Roseanne's permission. Roseanne agreed to let me drive for Dennis on the condition that I was not given food or money. Dennis agreed. But he also forgot his lunch in the truck every time I needed it. And he also forgot his change in the truck every time I needed it. And I only needed his truck when I went to Shelburne, which only happened once every 2 or 3 weeks. On these days, I would drive to Shelburne, get his bait, bring it back. Dennis would meet me in the shop or in the driveway, and he would pick out a shopping bag of the best cuts, which he said was for bait for catching bobcats. I took this home, and I salted it and cached the fish like I had the meat, hiding it in buckets in stone walls around Roseanne's property. I used it to make soups for myself, as Larry can't have fish or fish bones. And what I didn't eat, I did in fact use in an attempt to trap bobcats for my uncle. Roseanne Williams found out that I was eating lobster bait all winter. She didn't know if I had been given it. She didn't know if I had simply taken it. She couldn't risk asking Dennis about it in case he didn't know that I was eating lobster bait. This drove Roseanne to one of her many mental breakdowns that winter. These mental breakdowns started when she was kidnapped by her own mother and forced into her mother's house to wait on her mother hand and foot. I have explained Roseanne's abduction by her mother in an earlier video. This was done in order to prevent me from getting food, as most of these events are about preventing Larry and I from getting food. During these mental breakdowns, Roseanne would sit in her father's chair in the kitchen and whimper and cry and moan. "You don't know what he's saying. You don't know what he does." What I was saying was, you're going to prison every night, every pause, in every screaming match that Roseanne ever had. I told her she was going to prison for everything she was doing. And as to what I was doing that drove her, I was bringing Larry food every day, and I was eating lobster bait so that I wouldn't touch the food that I had for Larry. From July of 2017, I was beaten until I bled from my rectum by Roseanne Williams. From March of 2018, I was sodomized, often bleeding from my rectum, by Roseanne Williams. From March of 2018, the beatings often led to bile, diarrhea, and other mystery liquids leaking from my rectum. All of this occurred in Wilhelmina's kitchen while I stood at the table, shielding Larry with my body from whatever beating Roseanne was giving me. And it all got worse, and it all got more frequent, and over the summer and fall of 2018, Roseanne Williams grew more and more violent. Roseanne's son was home the first time, between September and October of 2018. He stayed at the cottage with his partner, and Roseanne stayed with him. When Roseanne's son left in mid-October, Roseanne stole almost all of my underwear. When her son called to say that he had arrived safely in Australia, I asked if he had taken my underwear by accident in some sort of laundry mix-up when he was packing. He said that he had checked and that he hadn't. When I confronted Roseanne about the missing underwear, she would only scream, "You don't fucking deserve underwear. If you're going to shit yourself like Larry, you can wear his dirty diapers." That was screamed at me every night from October to April. Roseanne had never provided pants or clothes of any kind. She had never provided anything that I would need in a Canadian winter, and I had returned from several years in Saudi Arabia, Southeast Asia, and Mexico. I didn't have any winter clothes. I didn't have any long pants. As my health declined, my metabolism collapsed, I detransitioned. Dennis knew something was wrong. He knew I was getting sick. And he was so upset by my appearance that winter. He was so upset by Roseanne screaming every day that I was too disgusting to go to town for her, that I was too disgusting to run her errands anymore. Dennis didn't know that these were excuses, that Roseanne was withholding food and money, and that she didn't want people in town seeing how sick I was. He didn't know anything about my failing health. He didn't know anything about the murder attempts. He didn't know anything about a host of things like starvation and malnutrition. But Dennis saw that I didn't have clothes, and it upset him. It upset him so much that he went into his father's closet. He went into his father's closet for the first time since his father had passed away years earlier. And Dennis got me a pair of his father's pants. I was given a pair of my grandfather's pants in the middle of everything that was going on. And Dennis got even more upset because I wouldn't wear them to supper. I wore them when I was in the woods. I wore them when I was working with him. But I wouldn't wear them to the supper table. I couldn't tell the man that I refused to be sodomized in my grandfather's pants. I had my first seizure in late August of 2018. I was outside the food bank where I had to go to get food for Larry since April. And I had to go into that food bank with shit and piss still in my pants, or my Uncle Larry wouldn't have anything to eat until next week when I could come back on a Tuesday again. No one had ever told me that soiling yourself was a thing during a major seizure. But I'd never had a major seizure before. I'd never had a seizure of any kind before. So it was a learning experience for me. It was 3 p.m. because I always snuck into the food bank as close to 3 as I could, which was its closing time. I did this so that if anyone saw me, it would appear that I was dropping something off, not picking something up. And 3 p.m. meant that there was a chance that Roseanne would show up to take Larry for a walk on the beach as a pretext to beating him at Wilhelmina's, and I wouldn't be there. I didn't have time to clean up or put the food away. It was still in the truck when I went immediately to Dennis to say goodbye, as the seizures was one of the milestones that my doctors had warned me about. It was my plan to go to Halifax the next day and admit myself to a hospital. I didn't get a single word out. The moment Dennis saw me, he broke down. He thought I was going to ask for something. I was just there to say goodbye. He collapsed, crying on the bench that we'd built lobster traps on since I was a child. He cried as he explained that I was the only one, the only family member that has never asked him for something, and that I can't ask him for anything today. He cried when he told me that I was the only person that stood up to Roseanne, that I was the only person that could take beatings for Larry. He said the one set of words that I despised the most from my family. You don't know what Roseanne is doing. You don't know what Roseanne is capable of. He then explained that since the 1st of July, since Larry had told Roseanne to fuck off, that she couldn't take his food away from him because she didn't live at home anymore. Dennis explained that since that day, Wilhelmina would call Roseanne at the cottage every lunchtime after I left in the mornings to tell Roseanne that it was safe to come to Beach Meadows, that Jeffrey was gone and wouldn't be back until supper time. Dennis explained that Roseanne had snuck into Beach Meadows most days each week for months to beat Dennis in private, to beat Dennis with just her and Wilhelmina present, while Roseanne threatened to put Wilhelmina in a hospital, to have her mother die in a hospital so that Dennis could never see her again. It was Wilhelmina's worst fear. It was Dennis's worst fear. The one thing Dennis had promised both his parents is that he would make sure that they were able to die in their own home. I left Dennis in the shop. I didn't know what to tell him, so I never told him why I was there. Wilhelmina saw everything from inside the house and told Roseanne that I had come to speak to Dennis in private. Roseanne made a special trip to Beach Meadows the next night to scream at me about asking Dennis for help. I told Roseanne about the seizures, because I always tell the truth. I told Roseanne about knowing she was beating Dennis in private and threatening to put Wilhelmina in the hospital. I told Roseanne that she was starving Larry and that was no different than stealing his pensions. I told Roseanne that stealing his pensions was exactly what her mother would do, that it's exactly what her mother had done when she forced Karen to steal all of my sibling and I's college funds in the early 80s. Roseanne went nuclear in her kitchen, screaming and storming out. The seizures happened on Tuesday. The confrontation with Roseanne was Wednesday. We had a break from everything on Thursday, but Roseanne showed up again on Friday because she wanted to get even. Roseanne, before and after this day, before and after this Friday, has always come to a meal before or after, never during the meal. She's never interrupted a meal before, except for this Friday in August of 2018. Roseanne Williams, to get even with what I had said about stealing Larry's pension, showed up in the middle of supper. She burst into the house while everyone was sitting and eating and laughing. She burst in screaming at Dennis that Bella, the therapy dog, was too fat. Roseanne was screaming that she'd just come from the vet and the cost of Bella's NextGuard, some sort of flea or tick medication, had gone up that month because Bella had gained too much weight and that it was all Dennis's fault. And without a blink, Roseanne turned on me, screaming, and just so everyone knows, I'm too fat as well. I've no clothes to wear when my son gets home next week, and it's all Jeffrey's fault. He leaves all these baked goods out laying around. He knows that I can't stay out of them. He does it on purpose to make me fat. Larry doesn't eat lunch. Jeffrey doesn't need all these baked goods. So I've taken all the baking supplies to the cottage. My son will need them when he's home next week. And before anyone could comment, Roseanne stormed out of the house. She was only there for a few minutes, long enough to scream at Dennis and I. And the sheer lunacy of that situation stunned everyone. Roseanne hadn't set foot in her house, not where Larry and I lived. She hadn't set foot in it all summer, and everybody knew it. I hadn't baked for her since she stopped bringing food and money in April, and everybody knew that. And as to Larry not eating, Larry told Dennis and Tammy what he had for his 5 meals and his baked goods every single day. Roseanne had taken the dog away from him earlier that year. It was the only thing he had to talk about, was the food that I baked for him and the suppers that Dennis made. If Roseanne wasn't at a supper to hear this directly from Larry, Wilhelmina made a point of calling her wherever she was at supper time to tell her what Larry had had to eat that day. It was part of how Wilhelmina and Karen were torturing Roseanne no matter where she went over the entire food issue. When Roseanne had stormed out of the house, everyone looked at me. I told them that I had no idea what she was talking about, but I was sure I would find out when I got home. And sure enough, I came home to find for the first time that Roseanne had searched the entire house and had stolen every single scrap of food in the house. as well as some of the baking dishes. Adding insult to injury, I had left the box from the food bank. It was empty, and it was unlabeled, but it was a cardboard box. I had left it in the porch, so that I could use it when I went to the food bank again in 2 or 3 weeks. Roseanne had stolen the box. She had loaded all of the food bank donations for her husband into the box the food bank gave me and taken them to the cottage for her son to have. This, of course, forced me to call the food bank and ask for an emergency donation on a Saturday. They gave me enough food for Larry and Larry alone, because that was the deal I had with them, to get Larry through until Tuesday, when I had to go back to the food bank and explain formally what Roseanne had done and why, and ask for a second 3-week donation of food.